Hello, my name is Jack Clayton, and welcome to my presentation about my paper for the conference about questions of accountability. The title of my paper is there on the slide, which is Neoclassical Realism and the Relationship Between Accountability and Public Opinion, US Foreign Policy Making in Relation to the Afghanistan Military Intervention and Withdrawal. The paper is divided into three sections. Firstly, it analyzes how neoclassical realism helps explain America's decision to leave Afghanistan through synthesizing international and domestic factors in its foreign policy making. Secondly, it discusses how a neoclassical realist perspective on the Afghanistan withdrawal provides insight into the tension between accountability to its public with the contemporary debate about America's global role. The third section discusses how neoclassical realism improves understanding of how the Afghanistan withdrawal was specifically done due to domestic factors and Biden's perception of how to be accountable to public opinion. A good place to start would be by explaining what exactly neoclassical realism is. The phrase itself was coined by Gideon Rose, who served in the Clinton administration on the National Security Council. And according to Rose himself, he writes that neoclassical realist theory explicitly incorporates both external and internal variables, updating and systemizing certain insights drawn from classical realist thought. Its adherents argue that the scope and ambition of a country's foreign policy is driven first and foremost by its place in the international system and specifically by its relative material power capabilities. This is why they are realists. They argue further, however, that the impact of such power capabilities on foreign policy is indirect and complex, because systemic pressures must be translated through intervening variables at a unit level. And to just further expand on that a little bit, neoclassical realists argue that domestic factors are needed to explain how systemic factors are actually translated into specific foreign policy decisions. When applying neoclassical realist theory to military intervention specifically, Colin Dweck is particularly useful for this, and he writes that first, executive officials necessarily hold some conception of the national interest and of potential threats to that interest emanating from developments abroad. Second, when perceived external threats to vital interests seem to necessitate military intervention, executive officials consider how best to pursue such intervention in light of domestic political conditions. Now, the same approach can be applied to the military withdrawal from Afghanistan through analyzing the decision because of the perception of the national interest according to President Joe Biden and how to best pursue the military withdrawal in the domestic political conditions. Now, the accountability of government to the public is key to democracy as a feature, yet it can be a challenge to implement practically. One of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, has a quote on his views about direct democracy, which, as the slide shows, he says, "It has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no position is more false than this. The ancient democracies in which people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny, their figure deformity." When it comes to representative democracy, which most Western societies that are democratic would be more familiar with, President Abraham Lincoln probably summarizes such a system best with his famous quote, that it is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. When President Biden announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a notable quote in his announcement was that America was going to end the forever wars. Now, what is undoubtedly true is that a more restrained US foreign policy approach has received far more attention in recent years, particularly since the political ascendancy and the presidency of Donald Trump. Trump's so-called America First rhetoric promoted a nationalist approach that advocated less military intervention and prioritized sovereignty. And although Joe Biden promoted different foreign policy principles such as diplomacy and American leadership, he nonetheless adopted a similar position on Afghanistan, stating during the time when he was a presidential candidate that Americans are rightly weary of our longest war. The first section is a neoclassical realist analysis of the Afghanistan withdrawal and the accountability to public opinion, which began to lose sight of the war's relevance compared to other international and domestic concerns. Part of President Joe Biden's justification for the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was that, in his view, the war was no longer in the national interest. Biden's approach, therefore, fits into Dueck's neoclassical realist model, whereby, quote, presidents usually begin by consulting what they perceive to be the national security interest of the United States. Subsequently, however, they consider how to best pursue those conceptions of national interest in light of domestic political incentives and constraints. Now, Biden, during his announcement of the withdrawal, said that since bin Laden's death, he said that we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since. Since then, our reasons for remaining in Afghanistan are becoming increasingly unclear. However, the Afghanistan war is in fact more complex than the War on Terror campaign. The war, of course, began in response to the 9/11 attacks, nearly a month later on October 7th, and had strong public support at 90%, according to a Gallup poll. The war itself actually had a very clear objective, and that was to defeat the Taliban that had been harboring al-Qaeda and to apprehend the mastermind of the 9/11 attack, Osama bin Laden. Although it is undoubtedly true that the Afghanistan war became a military quagmire, it did not provoke a political reaction or effect that could be described to be similar to the Vietnam syndrome amongst the American public opinion. The Vietnam syndrome would, in fact, be more accurately associated with the 2003 Iraq War, 2 years later. The Afghanistan War, in contrast, is actually often seen in a more positive light. Barack Obama described the justification for the Afghanistan War as far more righteous compared to the Iraq War, saying it was a war that we needed to win. And indeed, during Obama's presidency, the academic Trevor McCriskin argued that actually Obama handled the potential concerns of the Vietnam syndrome, which he described as the idea that the US public support for a long-term military commitment abroad cannot be sustained unless the objectives remain compelling, clear, and attainable. There is a demonstrable progress in achieving those objectives, and the costs in terms of lives and material are kept to an acceptable level given the objectives and the rationale for US involvement. He goes on to conclude that actually Obama handled those concerns very well, and it would be far more accurate to say that the 2003 Iraq War provoked these sorts of effects amongst public opinion, with huge protests that it provoked, with thousands of Americans protesting the war before it began, as well as 500,000 protesting during the 2004 Republican National Convention. Furthermore, there's also a much bigger academic consensus that it was the Iraq War that provoked a political effects similar to the Vietnam syndrome rather than the Afghanistan war. Now, if anything, what really defined the decreasing public support for the Afghanistan war was the public's lack of interest, rather than overwhelming vocal opposition to the war. Instead, it was really a matter of international and domestic concerns becoming more salient than the Afghanistan war, such as COVID-19 and the pandemic's economic damage and consequences that it caused. And when it comes to international issues, it was in fact climate change, according to the Pew Research Center, that actually was the public's biggest concern, albeit more so amongst Democrats compared to Republicans. But noticeably, what certainly seemed to unite, I suppose, the Republicans and Democratic voters, and that they seemed most closely aligned with, was that they both did not see the threat of international terrorism being a main concern, with only 24% of Democrats seeing this threat and only 28% of Republicans seeing international terrorism being a severe threat. It is therefore then fair to say that both international and domestic factors seem to be significant in how the decision to the Afghanistan withdrawal was made. The second section evaluates Biden's worldview and the accountability of America's global role to public opinion through a neoclassical realist approach, looking at the Afghanistan withdrawal. Now, although public opinion can certainly have a role in foreign policy making, as Duet says here, even the primary and immediate cause of a military decision, in this case military withdrawal, is likely to be some perception of national interest on the part of state officials rather than narrow domestic concerns. Now, this perception, in this case from Biden, that it's in the national interest to withdraw from Afghanistan, has at the same time provoked a debate about US foreign policy and what its global role should be, and what the withdrawal also says about its global role. There are some who believe that America should have a role of being a global leader, which many would say it has held, particularly post World War II. And adhering to this perception of being accountable to public opinion perhaps causes a strain in what America's perceived global role should also be. Critics, for example, of the withdrawal, and particularly how the withdrawal from Afghanistan played out, have said that it destroyed confidence in America's power and influence. This is according to John Bolton, a well-known foreign policy conservative hawk. It also reflects a more Wilsonian perspective of US foreign policy, to be more interventionist, internationalist, and looking at the quote from Tony Smith, being interventionist as a way to enhance national security by encouraging like-minded democratic states to come into existence throughout the world. There are other critics who argued that the withdrawal also represented American decline. The decliner school of thought argues that American power is ebbing, and it also discusses alternative grand strategies the United States could choose in order to delay, mitigate, prevent, or prepare for this inevitable decline. When discussing the Afghanistan withdrawal, Professor William Maley, for example, posits that when historians look back at the shambolic US exit from Afghanistan, it may increasingly appear a critical maker of America's decline in the world, far eclipsing the flight from Saigon in 1975. However, it is worth asking, does the withdrawal really represent American decline? Well, The paper argues that, in fact, it does not. This is because Afghanistan does not really mean a lot to the amount of power that America will or will not have. Ultimately, American military leaving Afghanistan will not significantly affect its power within the international system. Professor Joseph Yoff actually summarizes this point rather well, when speaking about the Afghanistan withdrawal, saying that it certainly damages three critical assets of a great power: reliability, credibility, and alliance cohesion. Nations will now think twice about committing to the US, hedging their bets by edging toward China and Russia. Decline, however, this is not. Great powers falter when their material assets wane, as in the case of Britain in the 20th century. By contrast, the US remains the greatest economic power, backed up by technological advantage and the world's most sophisticated army that can intervene anywhere on the planet, not to speak of the vast cultural clout China and Russia do not have. The Afghanistan withdrawal, therefore, doesn't necessarily represent American decline, but in fact being accountable to public opinion can in fact help address any threats to American decline, particularly during a time when the American public's faith in democracy has been tested, especially in light of the January 6th Capitol insurrection to try and overturn the 2020 presidential election. Essentially, America may need to actually promote and strengthen its values at home before it feels confident enough to be trying to promote them more readily abroad. The final section discusses how Biden's perception of being accountable to public opinion influenced the execution of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. A common feature consistent with neoclassical realism in military intervention is that domestic political incentives encourage particular forms of intervention that are suboptimal from an international perspective. This feature can also be applied to withdrawal. In this case, specific forms of withdrawals, including their timing, implementation, and public representation, are frequently powerfully influenced by domestic political constraints and incentives. In relation to how the Afghanistan withdrawal was done, Biden appeared to prioritize domestic incentives in how he conducted the withdrawal through his perception of being accountable to public opinion and what was in the national interest over the potential international consequences. Nevertheless, even though he may have perceived being the decision as improving accountability, it nonetheless will have consequences and further calls to accountability over how the withdrawal was conducted. Although the general public seemed to more broadly support the withdrawal, and even 63% of veterans from the Afghanistan war supported the withdrawal during the chaotic implementation of it, that does not make the Biden administration exempt from accountability in how they conducted it. And from an international perspective, the decisions by a president can result in counterproductive actions, particularly on particular military and foreign policy issues, in order to build domestic support for his broader approach. These counterproductive actions were definitely apparent through the fact that Biden appeared to leave allies in the dark, both regionally, as the Afghan president Ashraf Ghani seemed to be unprepared to tackle the Taliban without US support, and indeed fled very quickly because of the quick Taliban takeover. However, it also seemed to blindside traditional Western European allies, such as Britain and Germany, who were dismayed by the quick decision and chaotic fashion that America decided to leave. Therefore, the neoclassical realist model helps explain how Biden's perception of being accountable to public opinion influenced his approach to withdrawal. Furthermore, his desire to demonstrate accountability to domestic incentives was partly responsible to the withdrawal's suboptimal execution and the international consequences of frustrating allies by not consulting them. Debates about the accountability of the Afghanistan withdrawal to public opinion will continue, especially when being subject to congressional scrutiny. Nevertheless, this paper has aimed to analyse how the immediate decisions were made through trying to be accountable to public opinion. Thank you very much.